is Dr. Adekeye Adebajo. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, South Africa, since 2003. He served as the Director of the Africa Program of the New York-based International Peace Academy, and he has also previously served the UN missions in South Africa, Western Sahara, and Iraq. Dr. Adebajo obtained his doctorate from Oxford University in England and was also an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Adebajo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I think it's time to move the debate to the extreme left, if not ideologically, at least geographically. I start with a quote by Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the first African UN Secretary General, in describing the Bretton Woods institutions and the WTO, and he said, "These are organizations in which democratic values do not count for much in decision and policy making. The underlying objective of these institutions is to support the status quo, not to be critical of it," end of quote. So I think while it's important to support ECOSOC and the strengthening of it, it's also important to remember that the UN, in terms of development, accounts for a very small part of the structure, and Western governments tend to prefer to operate within the weighted voting systems of the Bretton Woods system that works for them. Peacekeeping is, however, an area where I think that the UN can make a much broader contribution, and its primacy in this area isn't questioned at all. So I will focus most of my own brief comments on the UN peacekeeping role. And peacekeeping, of course, is about the games that great powers play, and these games often determine the outcomes of UN peacekeeping missions in Africa and elsewhere. The 5 veto-wielding permanent members of the anachronistic UN Security Council still, as we've heard from other speakers, largely reflect the alliance of victors dating back to the end of the Second World War. So while Britain and France may have been great powers in 1945, I don't think anybody can really pretend that they are now. And what British diplomats, of course, like to say is that turkeys don't vote for Christmas, so why should we have an EU seat or, get off the council? But I think, as others have said, we need to have a council that reflects the balance of power in the world. Of course, the lack of legitimacy has also been described by others, but many of the archaic procedures and policies of the Council are well known to the 5 permanent members. They have privileged access to UN documents, and as we've heard earlier, decisions are often based on complex and not always visible trade-offs between these members, worked out over many years. So the first recommendation really is just joining what 2 other speakers have said. The Council needs to be urgently democratized with permanent members from elsewhere in the world, and it's a scandal that Africa and Latin America remain the only major regions of the world that don't have permanent representative. Second issue is UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's report in 2005 that called on donors to devise a 10-year capacity building plan with the African Union, which is currently developing a 15,000 strong African standby force. In 2008, an AU United Nations panel led by former Italian Prime Minister and former President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, came up with a sensible report and a sensible set of recommendations. It criticized the deployment of peacekeeping missions into difficult environments without the means to keep the peace, and made sensible proposals in terms of the UN actually supporting regional organizations that have deployed, and then paying for them for 6 months and then taking over those missions. That's an incredibly important proposal to make when we consider that 70% of the peacekeepers of the UN are deployed in Africa, about half of its missions, and many of the organizations that are regional organizations are quite weak. And it's a bit of a scandal that halfway through this 10-year capacity building plan of Kofi Annan, as it was reviewed, the funding for the implementation had not actually been approved. The support tends to be ad hoc. And I think these are some of the issues and challenges we need to look at. I just want to offer 4 lessons from looking at UN peacekeeping efforts over the last 5 decades or so that I think need to be taken into account for UN in 2025. First, there is a need to encourage external actors, particularly the powerful members of the Council, to ensure an effective UN role in regional conflicts. Second, you need an effective division of labor between the UN and regional organizations so that you don't have burden shedding, but rather burden sharing. Third, the UN needs to cooperate with local hegemons, as I call them, powers that are more capable in terms of military and financial resources. And fourth, I think the UN should develop effective strategies and refine its strategy to deal with domestic and regional spoilers of peace. You see in looking at cases of UN peacekeepers how powerful the P5 have been in terms of negative and positive ways. In terms of negative examples, the Western Sahara, you've seen France and the US basically block actions towards the self-determination referendum there. The US also played a negative role during the Rwandan genocide in closing down the mission rather than mandating it to protect civilians. And I think France has also sometimes acted like a pyromaniac fireman in Africa, seeming to continue playing the same role that it's played in what it sometimes considers its chasse gardée, its private hunting ground. And we've seen interventions in Chad 2006 and 2008 that, in my view, haven't been that positive. But more positively, you've seen big powers like the US play more positive roles in Somalia, the British in Sierra Leone, the French in Côte d'Ivoire, I think, was a more positive role. So I think we need to learn and harness those lessons. And I think another player that's quite important in terms of a new multilateralism in the world is, of course, China. China played quite an important role in getting a peacekeeping mission established in Darfur in 2007. It deployed 1,700 troops in 7 UN missions in Africa. And it's also, of course, the second largest economy in the world that is investing and building some of the infrastructure on the poorest continent in the world, Africa. So that is an opportunity, although there are also challenges which we can talk about in terms of China's role in Africa. I think there also remains an urgent need to avoid an aristocracy of death where the lives of African peacekeepers and Asian peacekeepers are worth less than those of Western peacekeepers, you know. Most of the missions on the continent of Africa at the moment are staffed largely by African and Asian peacekeepers, which does not give a good sense of a global mission. And I think it's also important to make sure that resources are also spread equitably so that you don't have $2 billion going to the rich men's wars, as Boutros Ghali called it, in the Balkans, while $150 million goes to conflicts in West Africa. It's also important, I think, to multilateralize hegemony, so that Nigeria, which played quite an important role in Liberia and Sierra Leone under ECOWAS, and the South Africans who played an important role under the AU in Burundi and the UN in DRC, their greater resources are used and taken advantage of, but by having a UN umbrella, that gives these missions more legitimacy. My final area, Chair, that I want to focus on and just mention is the need to deal with spoilers and keep refining the tools that the international community has used. Spoilers like Charles Taylor and in Angola, Savimbi, there were economic, political, and legal sanctions that were used against them that I believe helped end conflicts. The UN panels to name and shame countries and leaders that are supporting rebels could also be a useful tool. There were also positive inducements. For example, Mozambican leader Dhlakama was provided $20 billion to transform his guerrilla movement into a political party. And more recently in Burundi, you saw Pierre Nkurunziza's rebel group being brought into the transitional government before he went on to win elections. I want to just end by adding my own voice to what Ramesh had talked about in terms of the ICC. Africa, of course, believes in international justice, but it must not be a selective justice where you have all of the cases of the ICC in Africa, almost treating it like a guinea pig, and giving the impression that human rights abuses only happen on one continent. I think unless these cases are more evenly and equitably done, the ICC will lose its legitimacy. Certainly in Africa, that seems to have been happening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I will now open the floor to all the participants. I will start with those who have been left over on the list of speakers this morning, and then also turn to the others. I would ask everybody to be short, not to read long presentations, but to give the essentials, and if you have developments, written ones, you can bring them in via my office, and it will be part of the material we'll find on the website. I start now, and I would like you to take the floor for 3 minutes or so, otherwise it will be difficult to give the floor to all those who already are on my list. I start with giving the floor to the Third World Network representative, Bukima Muchala.